Thank you. I think probably by the time we're done with this, what you're going to find is there's kind of a consistent theme throughout the day. My background is I'm a bit of a junkyard warrior. Put myself through college buying and selling junk cars and rebuilding them and selling them into my driveway, and went from that to sites and buildings. So my career has always been built around the premise of if it's something somebody else doesn't want, I probably do. And that really is what led me into doing brownfield sites. It's something now I've done in terms of dysfunctional sites, contaminated sites, redevelopment sites since the late 70s, early 80s. And it's really become an area which I feel fairly strongly about. I think the ability to find sites, redevelop them, rejuvenate them in city cores are great examples of what you can do. I was involved with the Kaufman Lofts project developed in downtown Kitchener. We bought that site geez, I'm trying to think now. We bought that site in 1999, just as Kitchener was still in its doldrums and just as Kaufman had gone into bankruptcy. This site had a variety of contamination issues. Downtown Kitchener was pretty drab, but when you walked through what was an incredible building and it had lots of great bones, you saw it had great potential for redevelopment. The thing that attracted us as developers more than anything else to that was the city of Kitchener was throwing out the welcome mat. They were, kind of very aggressively welcoming people with open arms and saying, come and do business here. We'll help you get through the process. We'll help you understand what it is, and we'll implement the incentives to do. And I think they were probably one of the earlier municipalities to start to implement incentives, brownfield incentives, when nobody really understood what they were. And to us, that's a critical component of doing brownfield redevelopment outside of the GTA. Doing a condo building in downtown Toronto where you're getting $20 million an acre, it's a piece of cake. I mean, you can dig it out, you can do whatever you want with it. You get out into these markets where you're talking land values of $100,000 to $200,000 an acre, you can pretty quickly blow your brains out with a site contamination issue. And so we're very conscious of that. So with so try to move forward. Let's see if I can get this down pat. I'm kind of high-tech roadkill. So if I don't get this right, I hope you can be patient with me. In our perspective, sorry, I have to put on my glasses because I can't see it all either. Beauty of old age. For us, the first question in doing development outside of the GTA is whether or not we are working with municipalities that are engaged, want development to occur, are implementing brownfield programs, because if they're not, we're not interested. I mean, there simply isn't the economic viability in most of these municipalities to encourage us to come into a site and do a brownfield redevelopment when I can find a greenfield. And why do I want to take on the grief, the heartache, the additional risk, and the capital requirements to do a brownfield site? Because they are capital intensive at the front end. As Jamie will talk to you about later on, trying to finance a dirty site is often a real challenge. So many of these sites you end up working through alternative financing means until you've fully qualified them, you understand them, you've got remediation underway and or qualified or quantified to a point that you can do something with it. So some of the key questions are, can it be remediated, and what are the timelines? And you heard that comment earlier today. We've seen lots of sites, unbelievable properties, you just die to own them. But they're so damn dirty, you'll never clean them up. I mean, sometimes the best deal you do are the deals you don't do. And that's the challenge with brownfield sites. You really need to understand them, get into them, and due diligence is one of the critical components. Key questions that we, and I want to come back to a point that was on one of the slides that I put on my version that's not on the computer, which is the team. And it's doing, at the very front end of this process, due diligence is critical. And it's not one of these areas where you can say, I don't want to spend the money. Because if you don't spend the money, it'll come back to bite you later on. You have to build the right team consisting of a proper consultant that knows the market, knows the sites, knows the area, knows the community, a planner that really understands what you can do in the area, looking in terms of if you need legal help, and that's often a decision we don't make until we get down the pipe on a site. We want to understand whether or not it's viable because the lawyer's costs run up pretty quickly, and we have to really find that to really use their time in proper context, we need to understand what our problem really is, and until we've done our due diligence, we don't know what it is. And we also need to make sure we have the team assembled to help us figure out what we're going to do with the site afterwards. So getting that group put up front, doing the due diligence, the phase 1, the phase 2, spending the time to understand the site right at the very, very beginning is absolutely critical. Understanding whether or not it has off-site impact. Harry talked about that. I mean, it used to be the dog that really could bite you on these sites. You know, everybody was afraid that if you got into a site that had off-site contamination, as soon as you start to add value, the neighbor comes out of the woodwork and says he's going to sue you because now the site's worth something. Before it wasn't worth anything. So suddenly you become the target. So you need to understand it. And I say that a bit tongue-in-cheek because I've been doing this for 25 years and I haven't been sued yet. And I think it's because you end up being careful. You try not to buy sites that have known problems with antsy neighbors and ones that really will come back and haunt you. And I think Harry's comments about how the legislation's changing is really very beneficial for where we're going in the industry, but you do need to understand that risk, assess it, and determine how you mitigate it effectively, either with a development plan, how you implement your remediation, whether you agree to buy a site, implement remediation to stop the migration off-site and then close. There's all kinds of solutions to the problem. You just have to be very, very creative. And picking your choice of how you're going to remediate the site. There's lots of options. You can pick a full depth cleanup, which is, if I ever have my druthers, that's what I want to do. You know, I say to people, I married my wife, I don't want to marry a site. I want to know that when I finish a remediation, I'm finished with the site, I can be complete, I can transfer to a new owner, and it's gone. You achieve that through a full depth cleanup, which is a conventional full remediation to a generic cleanup background standard. There's a method that we use a lot, which isn't frequently used in the industry, and it's called a stratified cleanup, which is where you use one layer of remediation on the upper 1.5 to 2 meters of soil, a different remediation standard on the bottom. It can significantly reduce your cost, and there's no residual liability associated to it. You then head into Tier 2 assessments, which you've heard the comments on, which have limited use, and then risk assessments, which the reality is that's how probably 90% of the sites will go in the future. You need to be very patient, have lots of time to get through them, and lots of money. Now, our rule of thumb on risk assessments today is whatever the consultant tells you is the timeline, probably double it, and whatever the budget is, you double it. And unfortunately, that's probably where it's ending up, although for many sites, it is the only answer to get through the sites. Dave was talking about combining options. We're doing sites where we're doing a third of the site to a generic full depth of the site, full depth cleanup, and then the other 2/3 for risk assessment. The municipality's working with us to implement severances through posting securities, doing other things so they know the work's going to be done, but you really have to be creative in how you find the solutions to your problem. So then it's really a question of what are the drivers in the market to support the remediation of the development. You need to be able to really look at the project and say, when I'm finished, is this going to be a viable outcome? You know, in some of the markets, you can't sell a site with a risk assessment attached to it. If you're trying to do industrial commercial development today, doing that with a risk assessment today still is seeing its challenges because corporate owners don't necessarily want to take on a contingent risk because they have to carry it to their balance sheet. So you really need to be very careful and understand how that impacts, and I think Jamie will be able to speak to that and some of the questions afterwards. So you need to understand, when I'm done, what do I have? And is it a marketable product? I mean, the consultants will tell you can get through the process, but does it do you any good when you're finished? So you need to do that due diligence to say, what do I end up with and can I use it? And then what are your disclosure requirements? You get into this issue of who do you have to talk to when you do a remediation? Some of these sites you can do completely on your own. You really don't need to talk to your neighbors. Others, you end up having detailed discussions with abutting property owners, with the ministry. And if you're going to do that, do it early. Make sure you understand what you have to talk about and that you have your information correctly. Because once information about contaminated sites gets out into the public, people go a little crazy. In most cases, because they don't understand it. You know, you tell somebody that there's something in the groundwater underneath their house, you know, immediately it's every worst nightmare that they could ever think of comes to the table. The reality is, it doesn't matter because it's typically so deep it has no impact, but people just naturally get scared. So understand what the message is, how you're going to deliver it, and how you're going to tell them it's not an issue, and how you're going to manage the outcome of that product. And then when you're going through the project, is it financially viable, and how does it rely on tax increment financing, grants in lieu, development charge credits, building permit credits? For us, that's critical. Most of these sites now we look at, they are simply dead dogs in the absence of these programs. And it's great to see Brantford's advancing theirs. I mean, we basically don't look at a municipality outside the GTA with a Brownfield site today unless it has a program. Because otherwise, you can't make any money on these infill sites. Because the cost, the time simply doesn't warrant the inclusion of the program. Briefly talk about the choices of remediation. My preference, as I said earlier, full depth. Absolutely in your control. You know what your end product is. You can fairly effectively quantify your costs. And when you're finished, you're complete. The site is gone. The second option is stratified remediation. Again, clear-cut option, quick. How are we for time? Okay? I just want to make sure. Sometimes I talk too long and I get carried away. Stratified remediation, in our view, is the second best option. Again, manageable by the owner and the consultant. Nothing that affects the property afterwards. Nothing registered on title. It will require some construction controls. You'll have to implement potentially a health and safety plan. Your contractor will need to understand that if he digs up soil below a certain depth, it needs to go certain places and be managed properly. But it's a very effective, very usable tool. The Tier 2 method, as has been discussed, it had great thoughts when the ministry developed it. It was supposed to be the kind of the magic pill that could help get you bridge between the sites that didn't meet generic and that weren't quite stratified. The reality is it probably fits less than 2% of the sites that are out there. And I don't know anyone that's done a Tier 2 risk assessment and been able to basically use it in its as a sole resolution, but it's a tool to use. The Tier 3, which is probably what we're going to be doing with 90% of the sites in a couple of years, is really it's a great process. The ministry's well-intentioned. The system they've developed doesn't work. You can spend anywhere from 2 to 3 years doing it. A conventional, pretty plain Jane risk assessment is going to cost you $100,000 without a blink of an eye. You can pretty quickly drop $200,000 to $300,000 on a risk assessment. And when you've got your risk assessment complete, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a record of site condition. And understanding in the development community, all we care about is a record of site condition, because typically that's what drives your building permit, drives your severance, drives your site plan approval, or your zoning. So it is the get out of jail card that we need. So you really need to challenge your consulting team and understand and say, all right, if I go through this risk assessment, and to understand a risk assessment, it's like the Planning Act. You know, the risk assessment really takes you down to is basically a study of your site, and it's like that special section zoning bylaw on that little wee corner piece in your neighborhood that has the R3 section 152 zoning that says the side yard such and such, height such and such. The purpose of a risk assessment is it's that very finite look at your site, which drives different standards, different generic numbers that you can use, but also implements then constraints on what you can do with your site. And in some cases, the standards will say you have to hit benzene at 200. Your site may have benzene at 900. Well, until you hit 200, even though that's the new risk assessed level versus 5, you can't file your risk assessment, your record of site conditions. So there can be a time lag in that process that you need to think about. I'll just walk you through an example of a site that we did in Cambridge, and it was a great example of where we worked with a municipality that had implemented a program. It's one we just finished recently, an 8-acre site used since the mid-1800s to be developed for about 103 townhomes. When we bought it, the plant was still on the site. Rule of thumb, when you do your due diligence and investigations on these sites, everybody that knows anything about the history lies about what happened. You know, they won't tell you where stuff's buried. They won't tell you where the stuff is in the corners. They won't tell you really what they did on the site. So you might as well not ask the question in some cases. Or you need to know you're not going to get a truthful answer, because it's unfortunate because employees become pretty nervous about what happened on sites and whether or not they can be responsible. So this was a site that had been historical use since the late 1800s. Had variety of fill through the site, a number of uses. In the end, full depth remediation wasn't an option. Stratified was what we did see as an option because we could manage the fill on site. We weren't prepared to do a risk assessment because it was right in the midst of changing standards, and we knew it wasn't the right solution. And in our view, in Cambridge, you couldn't sell a site with a risk assessment and a certificate of property use. And the municipality had a workable brownfield strategy. So in the end, the site went through that process. It met all the standards. It was a workable, it eliminated the need for imported soils. And in the end, without the brownfield program that Cambridge had offered, which waived development charges, provided incentives for the phase 1, phase 2, covered the remediation costs, had that program not been in place, we wouldn't have done the project. Because by the end of it, our land cost and our remediation cost was more than 100% of the value of the property. And I don't do stuff for charity. I can't go spend $2.5 million not to make a dime on it in 5 years. So the tax increment financing and the brownfield programs really make these sites financially viable. So they're an integral part of understanding what your options are and your timelines. And one of the comments you heard about was the timelines. You know, thinking about what's the site I'm doing today, what's the market I'm at today, and pick your cleanup standard accordingly. Because if you're in a market that looks like it's got a 12 to an 18-month window, risk assessment's not an option. You better figure out whether or not one of your other options work and whether you can get through the process in time, because, you know, that risk assessment process, while it's a whole lot cheaper, timeline and outcome is unclear. So in conclusions, and I'll see if I have the same conclusions up on the panel that I wrote down. I probably don't. I can tell you right now, it probably doesn't look like it's favorable in my side of it. So understand what remediation the market will bear. Key question, you know, if you're in a really slow market, not a lot of absorption, you can only be so creative before the people say, well, I'll go over there and buy that house that doesn't have any warts attached to it. So make sure you understand what your buyer will accept. It's a critical component, because it doesn't really matter what you think. If you're not the buyer, it's really somewhat irrelevant. Now, I can tell this one's bad because it's going backwards already. Make sure that you have municipal support. In our view, that's critical. Making these sites work, getting a municipality that's got the welcome mat out, you know, seeing Brantford's initiatives, and I've been around this industry a long time. Marguerite's always been there, pounding the pavement for brownfield sites, and she's been instrumental in changing where the province has gone with its objectives, what AMO has done, what other groups have done, and it's a handful of municipalities that have really led the charge in making brownfields viable, and that's a great thing to have here in Brantford and to have the process moving forward. Make sure you understand the timing. Talked about that. You know, really understand what you're trying to do, what your sense of risks are, and timelines. Ensure it fits within your planning approvals. And this is one of the keys we find, is integrating this question of what's my contamination, what can I put on the site, and what's buildable and sellable. Now, we went through the argument with a while ago at the ministry, and they were saying, well, you know, they were talking about a site in Kitchener, in not such a hot area, and saying, well, you know, you can put in underground garages and all the rest of this to solve the problem. And I said, well, you know, $35,000 a stall, underground parking will kill you pretty quickly on a residential redevelopment. unless you can afford it within the site. The site wouldn't carry it. So the MOE solution wasn't right. So you really need to make sure that that built form integrates with real brownfield implementation and land use. And be realistic about achievability. You know, can you get it done in the timeline? I mean, I have yet to do a site on time, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I think I'm pretty damn good at it. And I haven't made one of my timelines yet, because there's always something there that you don't plan on. You know, it's the hiccup that you just simply don't expect on sites. And will it really allow you to make your market window? And I guess there were two more points that didn't make it onto this slide that made it onto my notes. And they are challenge your consultant. My consultants, in some cases, just hate me. I ask them questions, I challenge their decisions, I challenge their recommendations, because in the end, I'm the only one spending money. And in the end, ultimately, if it works, the municipality's there as my partner. But we have to challenge the process. You need to make sure you understand implementation, outcome, every option that you have through the process. And a good consultant's one that'll work with you to find the right answer that works for both of you. Gets the job done, that they can sign off on, but meets your objectives as a developer. And then my last comment is carry lots of contingency. Because on these projects, you always find things you didn't plan on. So if you're working on one of those budgets and you're working your tail off to make 20 grand on a project, on a $100,000 cleanup, you better walk, because you're probably not going to make it. So you need to make sure that you've got cushion on these projects from a financial perspective, because the rules change. We've had projects where midway through the stream, the ministry changed the rules on our remediation on one project doubled, because we got between the 2005 and the 2011 standards. So you need to be careful, and you need to do it effectively. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my comments, and I'm going to turn it over to Jamie Evans from the Royal Bank. Thank you.